Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to see you all here this evening. It's my privilege to introduce our speaker for this evening. I'm Dr. Michael Scott, one of the lecturers in the Department of Classics, and our speaker is Professor Alastair Blanshard, the Paul Ephialtes Chair of Classics and Ancient History at the University of Queensland, Australia. Alastair is also currently, the reason he's here in Warwick and not sunning himself in the Australian summer, is he's here as the Institute of Advanced Studies Visiting Fellow in Classics. And he's been with us over the past 3 weeks now, one more week to go. And during that time, he's really met pretty much every level of the Classics department, from our undergraduates in a variety of modules to our postgraduates, both in their taught MAs, the PhDs, as part of cadre. He's worked with, and here I go, he sighs deeply at everything that he's been doing. When the director of IAS saw his provisional program, the director went, well, that's the fullest looking visitor fellow program I've ever seen. And Alastair sort of sighed deeply and nodded, but has carried on with that British kind of bonhomie to the whole thing. He's worked with the Centre for the Study of the Renaissance. He's worked with film and TV studies. We brought in scholars from around the country for days looking at classics on television, looking at the use and abuse of the classical tradition. We have been everywhere around the university, and everyone has come to Alastair. And it's a testament to his insight, to his open manner, and to his willingness to get his hands stuck in and really muck in with the department and with the university, that he has, in such a short period of time, had such a transformative impact on so many of us. He was even willing to get involved with our drama day when 550 GCSE and A-level kids came to learn about the Lysistrata, in which he tackled the difficult issue of sex and gender with a whole lot of giggling 16-year-olds. This evening, and we're very privileged to have this lecture this evening, which is sponsored by the Global Research Priorities Programme, Connecting Cultures, and also the Faculty of Arts, to bring you a public lecture for Alastair to talk to the wider Warwick community. It promises to be, belying the title, the simple title of The Greeks and Us, a lecture where his strapline so far in the last couple of weeks has been, why weren't there serial killers in ancient Greece? Right? So without further ado, can I welcome Alastair?
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And can I just say, well, it's been an absolute pleasure to be here at the University of Warwick and to meet so many people. And I won't list them because I'm very conscious that I am the only thing between you and the drinks that have been laid out before you. So let me get on then with today's lecture, The Greeks and Us, except just to start by saying thank you, Warwick, for a really wonderful time. So in 1822, in the preface to his verse drama Hellas, the poet Percy Shelley uttered that now immortal line, "We are all Greeks." It's a bold, provocative claim, a claim for the transcendence of Greek culture, a belief that the Greeks are somehow eternal and universal. It's a phrase much beloved by classicists. However, a closer examination of the passage might make us a little bit wary about fully embracing the position that Shelley lays out for us. Here it is, here. We are all Greeks. Our laws, our literature, our religion, our arts have their roots in Greece. Well, so far, so good. It's where it goes next that starts to worry me. But for Greece, we might still be savages and idolaters, or what is worse, might have arrived at such a stagnant and miserable state of social institution as China and Japan possess. The human form and the human mind attain such a perfection in Greece, whose very fragments are the despair of modern art, that it has propagated impulses which cannot cease to ennoble and delight mankind until the extinction of the race. Now, this is a passage that in some ways makes me uneasy. As the dismissive references to Japan and China make clear, Shelley's vision of Hellenism is one that's profoundly Western in orientation. He has no time for the stagnant and degenerate nature of the East. The verse drama Hellas was written as a play to rouse indignation against the Ottoman Empire and its occupation of Greece. As such, Shelley's reclamation of Greece for Europe was deeply implicated in a kind of Orientalist politics that saw the East as the very antithesis of European ideals. At the very least, as we enter the China decade or the China century, we may want to recalibrate Shelley's claims. It's similarly a vision of Greece that is uneasy about the contemporary, the very despair of modern art, he declares. To love the Greeks involves a kind of nostalgia, at best a certain untimeliness, a sense of dissatisfaction with the present, a belief that there is more to life than the here and now. So on one interpretation then, what Shelley is offering is rehearsing a rather tired argument about the value of the classical tradition. Trumpeting the centrality of classical culture may have been a radical thing to do in the early Renaissance, but it's certainly become pretty dull and stodgy through repeated reheating over the centuries. And as we see, it's a rhetoric that flirts all too easily with the reactionary and the Eurocentric. Yet, I want to revisit this passage of Shelley and see if we can't view the passage in a new way, because it seems to me that Shelley is making two very distinct claims about the values of understanding the Greeks. The first is in terms of their legacy, right? Our laws, our literature, our arts, etc. But secondly, and more importantly, we should study the Greeks because they make us better. They cannot cease to ennoble. The first is a claim of affinity. The Greeks are us. The second is a claim of distance. The Greeks stand apart from us. They speak to us from their position apart and exhort us to do something different. And it's this second limb that I want to examine in today's lecture. The idea of the Greeks calling to us from higher ground is what I want to play with. How do the Greeks inspire us? How might this work? What might this look like? What happens when we view the encounter between the Greeks and us as an encounter of foreigners? I want to use the classical tradition then as diagnosing something significant, namely that for all those tremendous firsts in mathematics, philosophy, drama, history, political theory, and epic poetry, they don't happen by accident. Rather, they're product of a particular set of circumstances. And it's those set of circumstances I want to explore. What I'm going to propose is that Greece, and in particular the culture of democratic Athens, still has much to teach us about constructing a dynamic, healthy society, one in which the values of community and openness are reconciled with a culture of robust free speech. Now, one of the things that I've been interested in for a long time is the nature of crime. And in particular, I think crime tells a lot about a society. And what I want to do is examine the crimes in Greece, because when we examine crime in Greece, a number of things emerge from a very distinct criminological picture. So, for example, certain crimes, such as theft, are practically unknown, right? In comparison, they seem very low. Even now, the law on theft in Athens is pretty sketchy. Theft doesn't seem to be a crime that they regularly faced up to. In particular, one criminological feature has always intrigued me, and as you've already heard, it's why do we have no serial killers in the ancient world? Now, it's always trotted out that Rome at its height was a city the size of Victorian London. So the question is, where then is Jack the Ripper? Now, in the ancient world, you always knew who was killing you, and they always seemed to have a good reason for doing so. People move around in the city, and they do it in fear, but it's fear of gangs of political enemies, and not unknown killers driven by personal compulsion. Even if we accept Caesar's words of surprise, and you too, child, the phrase in Suetonius that will become et tu, Brute, in Shakespeare, the surprise that Caesar feels is political, not pathological. Brutus is a political opponent, not a monster. Indeed, death by unknown figures is extremely unusual in the ancient world. And when it occurs, it's a cause of great concern or discussion. Take, for example, in Athenian history, the assassination of the 5th century Democrat and associate of Pericles, the politician Ephialtes. A generation later, the lack of a definite perpetrator was so unusual that it could function as a rhetorical topos here in Antiphon's speech. The speaker of Antiphon stresses just how unusual it was not to know who the murderer is and how unequipped Athenians are for dealing with it. Discovering the killer of Ephialtes became a kind of cause célèbre in the ancient world. Everyone wanted to have a go. Even Aristotle has a go. In the Athenaean Politeia, he kind of gives you his idea as who he thought it was. And indeed, the game continues today. I've just given you a couple of recent crime fiction novels that attempt to solve the crime. Please don't see this lecture as an endorsement of them. They're both pretty terrible. But my aim in revisiting the case is not to tell you who actually murdered Ephialtes, but rather to give you a sense of what anonymous killing looks like in Athens. And it's as far removed from anything that we might call serial killing. In fact, no matter how hard we look, we can't find anything that looks like a serial killer in our sources. Further support for the idea about the absence of serial killers is provided by a consideration of the fact that we can't even find the structural traces of the crime. Not only is serial homicide not reported, but the Athenian legal system can't seem to comprehend the notion of serial killing. It doesn't seem to even be able to imagine the crime of serial homicide. It certainly provides no mechanism for dealing with it. And this is a kind of sort of minor technical legal point. But in Athens, prosecutions for murder could only be brought by family members of the deceased. There was no prosecution service to kind of bring murder charges. So this presents a problem for a crime like serial killing, where unless the serial killer happened to anonymously over time bump off members of the same family, there would actually be no way of actually bringing all those crimes to court. That is, there's no way you can join the action. So the crime of serial killing isn't even able to be imagined by the legal system. The legal system can't even imagine how this could work. You could certainly mention other crimes in the law case, but that wouldn't deal with the kind of religious issues, for example, that serial homicide would raise. So not only can't we find any serial killers, the legal system can't seem to imagine him. The closest we get in the Greek imagination to the serial killers are figures like the sort of monstrous bandits that populate the mythic cycles of Heracles and Theseus. Figures like Procrusties, for example, the offspring of Poseidon, who fits people to his bed, and if they're too long, he stretches them till they break, or if they're too tall, he kind of amputates off their limbs, the so-called Procrustean bed. Here is Procrustes being shown being killed by Theseus in two roughly contemporary stamnoi, the one on the right attributed to the Copenhagen painter, the left to the Cleophrys painter. Well, so far he does look a bit like the serial killer of the popular imagination. However, in the case of figures like Procrustes, there are a significant distancing mechanism that makes it hard to regard him as a figure like a serial killer. For example, one of the things that's always stressed is his kind of, there's not a mortal doing this, but in fact the son of Poseidon. And indeed the iconography of the vases goes out of the way to show it. In terms of iconography, he never appears alone, but is always part of a set of the adventures of Theseus. So, for example, if we look at the backs of these vases, that's the front side, these are the back side of the vases. The reverses show Theseus and the Minotaur, and Theseus and the Bull of Marathon. So these images, in some sense, kind of guarantee the register in which you're supposed to read figures like Procrustes, right? These stories belong to the mythic and divine, not the real and the prosaic. Procrustes, right, occupies the same kind of space as the Minotaur. Indeed, as an aside, some confirmation of this reading is, I think, provided by the comparative look at sort of the spectacular violence of Rome. When Roman emperors enact scenes of spectacular violence, here as exemplified by the the death of this woman in imitation of the mythological figure Dirce, where she's tied to the horns of a bull and trampled to death. They're, in some sense, when emperors do this, they're not actually behaving like normal individuals. They're behaving like gods, right? It's gods who are spectacularly cruel. It's the mythical which is spectacularly cruel, not the normal people. So this is the sort of flip side of imperial clementia. So we're left then with the problem, which is the absence of the serial killer. Now, part of the answer might be to say, well, there weren't any ancient serial killers, because even today there aren't that many around. I mean, part of the reason might be that, in fact, serial killers just are a kind of a rare phenomenon. And in some level that's got to be true. But what I'm interested in is what kind of discourses like criminology and psychiatry might say about this. And if we look at the literature on the topic, and I've spent many kind of happy evenings reading about serial killers, if you look at the kind of, there's a reasonably robust set of predictive factors for serial homicide. And here's the predictive factors for serial homicide, right? So a sense of isolation from community and family, a lack of place and role in social hierarchy, absence of figures able to mitigate social humiliations. And every time I look at this list, I always think it kind of feels like it's describing my life. But anyway, what's important about this list of factors is that they all kind of circulate around the idea of isolation and loneliness. Yet in the ancient world, in particular the ancient city, it's very hard, almost impossible, to be lonely. And in fact, actually, at this point I should confess that I'm not really interested in serial killers. What I am actually more interested in is, in fact, the absence of loneliness. Now, we have a concept of solitude, but loneliness is something else. In the ancient city, you're always surrounded by friends, family, or slaves. Your social status was fixed in a way that it wasn't in the case now. You weren't burdened with having to deal with problems on your own. Indeed, trying to find moments where you would ever exercise independent judgment in the ancient world is very difficult to find. Every decision, from marriage to sale of property to how you vote in the assembly, was done in concert with others. Finding lonely people in Athens is very hard. Indeed, this seems to me to be the point of Menander's play, The Discalus, the title which is all about a kind of grumpy misanthrope who just wants to be left alone. This is a play about someone who just wants to be left alone. And I've given you the opening lines of the play here, where he talks about how he wished he had wings so he could fly away from people, or he had Medusa's head so he could turn people to stone. Now, the whole point of this play is, in fact, to show the impossibility and undesirability of him ever getting his dream, right? The whole point of the play is to show how ridiculous it is ever to want to be alone. Indeed, the god Pan kind of intervenes to prevent him ever being alone, and the play ends up, like all comedies, with the kind of community reconciled together and a community forged not as he would have dreamed, torn apart. So, the play kind of plays to the idea of the impossibility of ever being alone. Even misanthropes like Diogenes thrived on human contact. Diogenes, the founder of the philosophical movement known as Cynicism, was infamous for his antisocial activities. Many stories are told about him in Athens. He's the figure who lives in a giant pithos storage jar in the center of Athens. Unshaven and unwashed, he kind of rolled his jar into the snow so it'd be kind of freezing cold, or he kind of embraces it on hot sand so he kind of swelters. Indeed, he's even given his name to a medical condition, the so-called Diogenes syndrome, Diogenes syndrome is a behavioral disorder characterized by domestic squalor, extreme self-neglect, hoarding, and lack of shame regarding one's living conditions, which often makes me think of my colleagues. However, it's striking to me that kind of when we talk about Diogenes having a kind of medical condition, that actually what we miss is what's important about all the stories about Diogenes. That is, that the important point about all the stories about Diogenes is that they always require an audience. Paradoxically, it's very hard to be misanthropic by yourself. It takes two to be grouchy. Diogenes is this person who kind of plays up to the audience, right? So his anti-sociality makes him a kind of tourist attraction. People like Alexander the Great will go to Diogenes to be insulted by Diogenes, he becomes his own kind of a tourist attraction. Indeed, to understand the importance of him having an audience, there seems to me to be no better illustration than the story of Diogenes wandering the city with a lamp during daylight hours, pompously declaring that he was looking unsuccessfully for an honest man. Now, this act only works if someone actually stops Diogenes to ask, why are you wandering the street with a lamp while the sun is shining, right? If no one stops Diogenes to talk to him, he doesn't get to deliver his punchline. Without an audience to play off, right, Diogenes would just be a madman living in a barrel, right? It's society that makes him a philosopher. Now, of course, one of the things I want to go is think about kind of the community. But no community was, of course, without tensions. And alongside the notion of this kind of idea of community and the absence of loneliness, I want to look at some of the ways in which Athens dealt with some of its underlying tensions. How did Athens achieve social cohesion? In particular, I want to run Athens alongside one of the other great social problems confronting us today, namely the gap between rich and poor. Indeed, you don't need me to remind you of the issue. In June of last year, the IMF warned that in developed economies, the gap between the rich and poor was largest in the decades. Our media is saturated with the statistics. 3/4 of the world's income is held by 20% of the population. The poorest 40% of the world's population owns only 5% of the world's wealth. In the US, the top 1% own more than the bottom 90% of the population. In the US, the gap between the rich and poor is now 70 times larger than it was in 1979. So this is a problem that in some sense is pressing. And yet the point that I'd like to raise is that this is not the first time that we've seen such problems. The ancient world knew spectacular wealth and spectacular poverty. Indeed, every time we try and model the ancient economy, we get figures roughly comparable to kind of a sort of 1% division. The wealth of antiquity has passed into idiom. It seems to be not accidental that we have, in fact, two dueling phrases, as rich as Crassus or as rich as Croesus, because both of them, in a sense, can be founded on ancient literature. The wealth of Marcus Crassus was legendary amongst the Romans. Pliny famously estimated his wealth at his death at 200 million sestertii. Now, there have been numerous attempts to kind of calculate what Crassus's net worth would be in modern terms. I mean, all of them are kind of methodologically flawed. But, if you were to entertain them, you'd work out that his wealth is about $8.4 billion, which would put him at number 160 on the Forbes list of world billionaires, which is in fact 8 places ahead of Giorgio Armani, who is the next wealthiest Italian on the list. However, it's not just Crassus that I want to talk about, but the other great figure of wealth, Croesus. Now, Croesus is known for a number of things. His wealth came from the gold-rich kingdom of Lydia, and it was this kingdom from which kind of the idea of coinage came to the Greek world. The dates of his reigns are somewhat debatable, but it's about the 6th century BC. Now, 2 stories are told about Croesus. And they illustrate the lessons that I want to kind of explore, which is being rich is not the same as being happy. The ancients knew this story well, and they illustrated this kind of maxim with a variety of tales. The most famous one is the one involving Solon and Croesus. Solon was a kind of travelling sage who wandered the world, and eventually he comes to the court of Croesus. And Croesus, hearing the wisdom of the wisdom of Solon, invites him to a great banquet. And there in the palace, after enjoying great food and wine and revelling in luxury, the king turns to Solon and he asks him, "Who is the most blessed of all men?" Well, naturally, right, Croesus expects Solon to say Croesus. So he's a little point out when Solon tells him a story about a poor Athenian farmer named Tellus who lived healthy life, had numerous children, and died a glorious death defending his city. So the king pressed him again, thinking at least that he would get second place. And so he was nonplussed when Solon told the story of Cleobus and Biton, who had, as a sign of strength and piety, carried their mother in an oxen cart to Delphi, and then were rewarded with a peaceful death in the sanctuary. When Croesus finally asked why his name wasn't on the list, he received this famous reply from Solon, that is, that I count no man happy until he is dead, right? Pointing out precisely about the contingency of wealth and also getting you to rethink about the value of what makes you happy. Now, it's an apposite observation because a few years later, Croesus, following some dodgy advice from the Delphic oracle, he asked the Delphic oracle should he fight the Persians, and they told him that if he fought the Persians, a great empire would fall. They forgot to mention it was his empire. He goes and attacks them and is defeated. And he remembers the story about I count no man happy until he is dead, when he's actually on the pyre that the Persians have built for him. And he starts to weep. And the Persians ask him, "Why are you weeping?" And he tells the story of his encounter with Croesus. They're so impressed by the story, and particularly the values behind the story, that they then free him. So the point of these stories is a story to get you to think about what constitutes a happy life and the vagaries of fate that you can't control and the contingency of wealth. And this is a popular theme in ancient narratives. The story of the sword of Damocles, much more famous these days than the story of Croesus, kind of captures the same point, right? The story, I think, is known well by all. It's set in the court of Diogenes of Syracuse, again, one of these fabulous, wealthy ancient monarchs, and involves the obsequious courtier Damocles, who keeps on telling the king how lucky he is, how fortunate he is, how wonderful he is. And the king, eventually kind of irritated by Damocles, invites him to sit in his place. And Damocles does, and he takes the seat, only to look up and discover that the king has positioned a sword above his head, hanging by the slimmest thread, a potent metaphor for the danger that the king is constantly in. And the point is that as a result, Damocles is no longer able to enjoy any of the fabulous food that has been laid out before him. That is to say that, again, it points you in the direction about thinking about really, are riches the kinds of things that make life worth living? And the list of stories about the fact that wealth does not equal happiness are numerous. I mean, what is the story of Midas but a similar story about the fact that wealth and happiness don't go together? Indeed, on one level, Greek tragedy is all about the idea that teaching us that wealth does not lead to happiness. We might want to pair these myths with myths also about the dangers of overconsumption. The best of the ancient myths relating to this is the myth of Erechthon, a king who desires to expand his palace, and he cuts down a tree in which a nymph lives, only then for him to be struck by unquenching hunger, so much so that he sells his daughter for a loaf of bread, and so hungry that he keeps on kind of eating everything before him, eventually consuming himself, leaving only a pair of snapping jaws. And if you wanted a kind of potent metaphor of a symbol of overconsumption, it's the snapping jaws of Erechthon. Now, the popularity of all these Greek myths kind of speaks to their utility. They teach us to rein in our desires. They teach us to rethink our priorities. They teach us to want things other than wealth. And in doing so, I think these myths point to a certain kind of impoverishment in our own public discourse about the extremes of wealth. I mean, for example, it's absolutely true that whenever there's a big lottery jackpot, the tabloids will run stories about how people's lotto wins completely ruined their lives. But inevitably, there's a kind of class prejudice that runs through these stories, right? So the lotto lout or the king of the chavs lotto winner, is evoked. It's sort of perpetuating class and wealth distinctions, rather than, as I suggest, what Greek myth does, which is actually critiquing it. So that's my kind of second point, which is to kind of think about the way in which communities, divisions in communities are built up, particularly the division between rich and poor. The final point that I want to kind of address in my lecture today is how Greek societies treat strangers. And here I want to push back against a bit of a trend in scholarship on the Greeks. That is, it's become very fashionable these days to deride the Greeks for their xenophobia and ethnic stereotyping. Works such as Edith Hall's Inventing the Barbarian, Benjamin Isaac's The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity, and François Hartog's The Mirror of Herodotus, the representation of the other in the writing of history, have been very good at bringing our attention to the ways in which the Greeks could be exclusory and xenophobic. Yet it's worthwhile pointing out that most of the extreme material comes from a period of the Athenian Empire, an empire which was itself kind of based on a sort of myth about resisting the Persians. So in a sense, it comes from a very particular kind of time point. Indeed, it's worthwhile even pointing out that for all the talk about exclusory nature of Athenian life, its treatment of, for example, war refugees was actually exemplary. In 427 BC, the allied city, for example, of Plataea was destroyed by the Spartans at the opening of the Peloponnesian War. Destitute Plataeans turned up at the walls of the city of Athens. Now, the Athenian response seems to me to be really striking at this point, is that not only do they welcome the refugees from the destroyed city of Plataea in, but in an extraordinary move that I find really hard to parallel, they offer them complete citizenship within the city. Indeed, it's a generous act that could still be celebrated over a century later in the 4th century. So that, for example, I won't give the passage, but what's striking is that here an orator records the decree that was given to the Plataeans, right? On the motion of Hippocrates, it is decreed that the Plataeans shall be Athenians from this day and shall have full rights as citizens, and they shall share in all the privileges in which the Athenians share, both civil and religious, save any priesthood or religious office which that belongs to a particular family, and that they shall not be eligible for the office of the 9 archons, that's to say the most important of the state offices, but their descendants shall be. It's an extraordinary inclusive document and an important reaction to a dispossessed populace. It's also not a one-off. Athens makes the same offer to, in fact, the dispossessed citizens of Samos at the end of the Peloponnesian War. So the Peloponnesian War is book-ended by these 2 acts of extraordinary generosity for refugees, welcoming them and offering them citizenship into the city. Indeed, the poor citizens of Samos had been dispossessed by the Spartan general Lysander, who had established a kind of pro-Spartan government on the island, and they end up in Athens. And we can find them living for at least 3 or 4 generations still in Athens. Now, in some ways, we shouldn't be surprised by these acts. After all, they're in fact just the extension in legal principles of the principles of guest friendship and supplication that had always been important in Greek life. After all, what is the Odyssey but in fact the epic of the asylum seeker? But it's not just with their fellow Greeks that they engaged. And what I want to look at now is the way in which they engage with the outside world, especially non-Greeks. It seems to me there's another strand running through Greek culture, which is a theme of curiosity, a sense of wonder, a desire to engage with the foreign other. Arguably, it's that sense of wonder that created the discipline of history. The opening words of Herodotus' history, the first work of history in the Western tradition, captures this feeling. Herodotus here displays his inquiry so that human achievements may not be forgotten in time, and great and marvellous deeds, some displayed by Greeks and some by barbarians, may not be without their glory. Right, history is a catalogue of great things, but importantly, it's great things that not only Greek, but also barbarian. The very foundational document of Western history writing makes this clear. This catalogue of marvels is always going to be, at some stage, engaging with the other. Now, cataloguing marvels begins with Herodotus, and it's a project that the Greeks continue for centuries. The most famous catalogue of marvels is, of course, the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a list compiled at some point in the Hellenistic period and then gradually cements over time. Here are the 7 wonders. Those of you who are kind of trivia buffs will have already got them already. But what's important to note is that this list is not exclusively Greek. Just as Herodotus regarded the achievements of the barbarians as worthy of inclusion in history, so too does the 7 wonders of the ancient world include the great pyramids of Egypt and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Now, the pyramids of Egypt, one can understand, as anyone who's been to the pyramids, it would be hard to draw up a list of ancient wonders that doesn't include the pyramids. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, however, are a very different matter. And the main reason why their inclusion is so odd is because no Greek ever saw the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. By the time the list was drawn up, they were long gone. Indeed, it's highly likely, and I had to break things to you, that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon never existed. They're a myth. We can't find any archaeological evidence for their existence in Babylon. The stories about them are inconsistent and don't make sense. What seems to be happening, and here I'm following Stephanie Dolby's line, that some fabulous gardens in Nineveh over time have been embroidered and elaborated and get translated to Babylon. So if you want to be a real pedant, it's the Hanging Gardens of Nineveh that we should be talking about. But the fact that we have an invented wonder by a foreign power that no Greek ever saw, nevertheless makes it to our list, I think speaks of a deliberate desire to include non-Greek works into the list. A belief that wonder exists beyond and is not owned by any particular ethnicity and nationality. And this notice of kind of curious engagement runs deep through Greek thought. We see it in the early pre-Socratics. Take, for example, Xenophanes, who observes that the nature of God varies from culture to culture, and the nature of divinity is embedded in that culture. So here's the famous fragment: the Ethiopians make their gods dark and snub-nosed, while the Thracians make them blue-eyed and red-haired. And I'm always interested in these red-haired gods. Fantastic. Normally, in antiquity, red-headed people are burnt to death as a sign of kind of evil influence. So, I appreciate cultures where their true divinity is recognised. Now, it's this observation that allows him to make his more radical conjecture that God is only relative and that our understanding of God might be flawed. As he observed, and this is the other fragment, if horses and cows could make images of gods, they'd produce gods that looked like horses and cows. Now, you can only make this radical thought experiment if your starting point is that not that the Ethiopians are wrong or deluded, but rather that they're actually onto something, right? That there's some kind of value in it, or that their representation of the gods is just as valuable as your representation of gods, right? So you can only get to here if you kind of take this stuff seriously. And it's, I think that is the really important move for me. And what's important for me is the way in which this idea of the value of the foreign other is a theme you can actually trace through in amongst the kind of xenophobia and ethnic stereotyping, trace it through quite strongly. And where it comes to, of course, to the greatest fruition is, of course, in the Hellenistic period, where we start to see these extraordinary expansion of hybrid cultures where Greeks and other foreign peoples engage. Here I've given you an example of some of the Greco-Buddhist art that emerges out of the extraordinary interaction between the Greeks and people living in the Hindu Kush. I always love this image of Buddha and Hercules together. You often wonder what they would have talked about. It's also that same kind of hybridity that allows something like the Ptolemies, for example. Here I've given you two portraits of Ptolemy Philadelphus, one in Egyptian style, one in Greek style, again to show the way in which Greeks can function in two kind of aesthetic regimes, in two kind of cultural systems. And it seems to me that that's kind of that ability to kind of engage with the other in sort of interesting ways comes out of a long tradition of Greek thought. So let me conclude by thinking about the future. And I want to kind of finish with an example of which I'm tremendously fond. When extraterrestrial life first encounters mankind, it's going to be disappointed. If NASA's plans work out, aliens should arrive expecting a planet populated by creatures with the physiques of classical statues. The fatter, softer, older, and more ethnically diverse reality of the world will come as a huge surprise. Certainly, that's a strong impression given by the plaques attached to the Pioneer 10 and 11 spacecraft. That is, that humanity only comes in one shape, and that shape is Greek. The Pioneer plaques, described as mankind's first serious attempt to communicate with extraterrestrial civilizations, were designed by the American cosmologist Carl Sagan and his wife Linda. Here they are together, looking so happy. Composed of gold anodized aluminium, the plaques are designed to survive in the vacuum of space for over 100 million years, making them, in fact, mankind's most durable artifacts. When the Earth is no longer habitable, those plaques will still remain as testament to how mankind saw itself. The plaques are divided into two sections. The radial lines on the left of the plaque represent the position and periods of 14 pulsars with respect to our solar system, which should allow alien civilizations to pinpoint the time and location of the spacecraft's launch. The right-hand side represents the species that sent this probe into space. Now, the Sagans were explicit about the influence of Greek art in their drawing of mankind. The body shape and proportion that arrived from Greek sculpture. Only in their hairstyles do we make a concession to contemporary fashion. So aliens are going to arrive expecting kind of Greek bodies, but with 70s hair. The figures were depicted nude because that's what Greek art decreed. It also meant, importantly, that the bodies were hairless. The Greek idea even kind of determined the form that nudity took. One of the most controversial elements of the representation related to the depiction of the woman, And a fact that a lot of female activists got upset at the time and led to, in fact, picketing of NASA was, in fact, the lack of female genitalia in the representation of the women. Once again, the Greeks were deployed, challenged about the lack of any hint of external genitalia in the depiction of the woman. Carl Sagan responded that the decision to omit a very short line in this diagram was partly made because conventional representation in Greek statuary omits it, which again sort of justifies the position. Now, there's a lot that one could say about this representation of humanity. Yet for me, what's really striking about this, as so often the case in human history, that when we have to think about what it means to be human, when we want to represent ourselves to our best of our ability, when we want to reduce ourselves to our essential essence, it's to the Greeks that we turn. The Greeks run through our cultural DNA. They set the parameters of what, in a sense, it means to be human. Yet more importantly, when we think about how we might want to reach out to engage with an unknown other through the vast distances of space, as I've hoped to show you tonight, the Greeks might be a very good place to start. So, thank you.